So I think this conversation is especially timely. I'm just thinking about the last year, and as a professor here, the kinds of anxieties and dismay I heard from and experienced in terms of students after the results of the presidential election. I think about the physical violence in Charlottesville, Virginia, that we all witnessed. I think as well about the various studies that have been produced about differences, wide differences of opinion among various racial and ethnic groups about racial inequity, racial injustice in this country, the kinds of misperceptions that exist. And then I also think about even just this past weekend and the debates that emerged around athletes' right to protest, right? So I think we should begin this conversation by first off reflecting, and I'm interested in hearing your opinions about, does the title of this panel, The Racial Divide, accurately reflect the US political affairs today? You know, is there a racial divide, politically, economically, culturally, generationally? And if so, it'd be great to hear some specifics. And I think, at least the style, it's open. So, you know, whoever wants to jump in first can.
Is there a buzzer that we need to hit, or?
We can just use your water.
Okay, there we go. There you go. Bang that there. Okay, cool. Well, first of all, let me say I'm very appreciative to be a part of this panel, appreciative to the Unruh Institute for having me here, and grateful to be in the company with so many excellent thinkers and commentators, and Mr. Frazier, grateful to you as well for your presence. It's pretty obvious, I think, to everybody in this room that there is a racial divide in America. Now, it's not a new thing necessarily. I mean, part of what characterizes the history of the United States is that we have very tense and frictious racial histories. But one thing that's true is that, generally speaking, the different ethnic groups in the United States experience life in America and receive sort of our narratives about what it means to be an American in different ways, and that's something that manifests itself to great extent in the controversy that we see over the over the flag and the anthem, and the proper way to protest and bring attention to a subject like police brutality, for instance. But you can look at different data and see statistically how some of these attitudes break down. So the Brookings Institution did an evaluation of voter attitudes where they polled African Americans, whites, Latinos, and asked them, how much do you trust the two parties? And among millennials in particular. African Americans tended to trust Democrats at rates of about 47%, Latinos at about 36%, whites at about 22%. Then you ask them how much they trust the Republican Party. That rate comes down to 10% for African Americans, I think about 15% for Latinos, but about 18% for whites. Now, even though white millennials also vote more Democratic, not by as wide a margin by any means, but it lets you know that among white millennials, there's not so much a qualitative distinction in terms of the level of trust or distrust that ought to be had towards the two parties. Whereas for minorities, and certainly for African Americans, there is a qualitative distinction made. There's sort of a sense or understanding that one party may not exactly be the heroic party. I think it's an overstatement to suggest that African Americans are in love with the Democratic Party. But there's pervasive distrust, whether it's fair or unfair, of the Republican Party, and you can see similar breakdowns in attitudes towards law enforcement and other institutions in this country. And that gives us a window into the fact that for many minority groups, and certainly for African Americans, the distrust of institutions goes beyond simply having a basic sort of lack of preference or lack of enthusiasm for one institution or another, but actually goes to the point to where certain groups feel that certain institutions that are very prevalent in American life are actively arrayed against the interests of certain minority groups. And so that illustrates, I think, a fundamental divergence in the way certain groups of Americans see the country holistically and certainly institutionally. And it has consequences. Oh, that's all I got.
So I think for me, just to preface a little bit about what I do at CAUSE, the Center for Asian Americans United for Self-Empowerment, is we do a lot of voter outreach, training, and education, as well as leadership development programs for people looking to run for office or who want to be emerging community leaders. That being said, I'm extremely humbled to be on this panel. It's so important for us to consider the concerns of the Asian Pacific American community when it comes to politics. A lot of times when we talk about communities of color and the minority vote, Asian Americans always tend to get left out of that conversation. So that being said, what I think is interesting looking at it from an Asian Pacific American lens is that I see a racial divide. It's going in and out. Thank you. I see a racial divide, but I also see an ethnic divide within that racial divide. And what I mean by that is that by no means is the Asian Pacific American community a monolithic community. I think everyone expects us to be on the same page. And I know that many of my Latino colleagues feel the same struggle and plight as well, of carrying the need to kind of, or the urgency to feel like you have to be on the same page when that's not necessarily the case. So that being said, within the Asian Pacific American community, you've got people who are East Asian, you've got South Asian, you've got Southeast Asian American. And within that, where each community is politically, as well as economically, generationally, it's very extremely diverse. So that being said, I see a huge difference across these communities. Many people don't know, but in the Tongan, Bangladeshi, and Cambodian American communities, those are communities that see poverty at the lowest rates out of everyone in this country. And they're also seeing low voter turnout rates as well. I'd also say that culturally, I think within the Asian Pacific American community, you see different moods and reactions and attitudes with regards to politics. A lot of our community is coming from immigrant backgrounds where reactions and kind of interactions with politics are very different depending on that immigrant background. And last but not least, I do see generational differences even among our own community, whereas the younger, more native-born Asian Americans tend to lean more liberal and democratic, whereas older generation tend to rely more on ethnic media outlets, the need for in-language, tend to vote less because of that need for in-language outreach is not often met. So those are some of the issues that I would bring up to the discussion.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that interesting question, Taj. I mean, I would say that there is a racial divide in this country. There's also a generational divide in this country, and the two go together in many ways. The racial divide is one, as John said, that has always been present, but it's a divide that has widened as many long-settled white Americans in particular are grappling with the changing racial ethnic demographics of this country. And this, of course, is a divide and fears about the browning of this country that Donald Trump exploited by running a racist campaign, and one that he continues to fuel, and that is really affecting how youth of color see themselves in American society today. I want to mention that we're in the midst of two very dramatic demographic shifts and racial shifts. The first is rising diversity, of course, among millennials. Just under half are people of color. The millennial generation is really characterized by this racial and also economic diversity. On the other hand, we have this rapid aging or graying of the baby boom generation. And they are disproportionately exiting the workforce and retiring. And really the browning and the graying of America is part of this large racial generation gap. Some of our colleagues here at USC have written a lot about this racial generation gap, the fact that many aging whites hold a disproportionate amount of power in American society and don't see themselves in today's youth of color and don't see today's youth worthy of investing in. And so this intergenerational compact on which our country used to rely and on which it depends has been eroded. And because there is such a low voter turnout traditionally among today's youth and among millennials, you really have this older generation that are voting on policies that affect today's youth. And I would also say that many millennials of color in particular understand firsthand that race continues to be a significant factor in their lives, and they are coming of age in a society that is hostile to them, and that is also increasing in terms of economic inequality. And so we've seen increasing inequality of wages and wage stagnation, and increasing wealth inequality. And it's very different than the context that boomers faced as they came of age.
Thank you, and again, thank you for having me. The short answer to the question is yes, of course, there's a racial divide. I would really say it's divides now, as opposed to, you know, the traditional construct of America's original sin, which, you know, when I was an undergraduate studying at Georgetown on race and ethnicity and politics, I couldn't find any discussions on Latinos and Asian Pacific Islanders. The whole construct, especially in major swaths of this country's geography, about the white and black paradigm, and that continues to be the lens, I think, while it's mitigating now, it continues to be the major lens with which we view the racial construct of America, rightfully so. But there is one larger trend which I have through the course of my work as both a practitioner and somebody who, you know, researches opinion with all these varied constituencies, want to bring out. I think Jody was mentioning, or started to get to that towards the end. The two demographic changes that she was referring to are absolutely, no question, a big part of it, but there's a third, which I think may be the most significant, and that is the class stratification that we're seeing in America today. We have in our history been through similar circumstances. The Gilded Age, for example, was a time where you saw tremendous stratification of the classes. What we didn't have at that time was the diversification of America that, again, Jody was pointing to. And so what you have in America at this point in time is two enormous transformations. The first is the changing, the browning of America first, and the second is this class stratification. Either one of them, by the way, is significant in overcoming. We have faced the economic conditions before, and through a tremendous amount of struggle and dramatic economic reformation, we were able to proceed beyond it. There has never, ever been a generation of Americans of white European ancestry leaving America, quote unquote America, to a country of non-European ancestry, and this will be the first generation that does that. The question becomes, will we continue to see America and Americanness through the traditional racial construct in the midst of these two changes? And the reason why I think it is so difficult and why the divides, plural, exists is because of the class problem. Let me expound on that just a bit before we get into the real conversation here. And that is that as long as the poor and the shrinking middle class in this country is not able to develop a cohesive economic agenda, there will never be any sort of ability for America to come together cohesively on racial lines. And it is why you increasingly see poor white Americans who are establishing their own identity differently than they have in the past say things like build a wall. I think that that's somehow a productive solution to something. And it's why on the left you can hear things like Black Lives Matter for fully justifiable, understandable reasons. But as long as each one looks at the other and says that the other is reprehensible because of those, you cannot have a cohesive economic agenda that lifts people up out of poverty. And as long as our poor and middle class are not able to come together because of a racial barrier, you are never going to see a healing in the divide. One of the great things about human history is that the wealthy people throughout human history, across cultural and lines, have by and large, there's obviously exceptions, by and large, gotten along okay, pretty well. It's where those that are struggling economically can't find a cohesive economic agenda that the racial tensions get exacerbated. So while the diversification of America, the browning of America, is a significant challenge in and of itself, It's the economic tensions that I think that we're undergoing, the technological advances that are dramatically changing America, which are exacerbating those tensions, and I think have led us to what ultimately became 2016.
Can I ask a follow-up question based off of some of these comments in terms of about kind of expanding class divide, but as well the shifting racial, ethnic demographics of the country? Can we talk a little bit about the kind of intersections of class and race, like how poverty is experienced differently among various racial groups, about, I guess, also the racial dynamics to poverty, and as well how that impacts, as you're describing, the perceptions and misperceptions both about what life is like for other Americans or what life is like for other racial and ethnic groups. I'm just really interested. To your point, I've seen a number of studies that talk about the vast misperceptions and perceptions about class and about race. And oftentimes you're right, when it's framed, it's primarily among Black Americans or white Americans, kind of juxtaposed about how Black Americans look at the police as an occupational kind of force, you know, and as a threat, whereas many white Americans say, oh, for the most part, not as much, you know, and when they think about the kind of economic standard of the country, Black Americans say, oh, we don't see it kind of moving in a progressive kind of direction, whereas some white millennials think things are actually moving in that direction. So I'm just interested, and you guys can talk about, not just simply in relation to Black Americans and white Americans, but as well in terms of Asian Americans, Latinos, in terms of what are their perceptions about the intersections of race and class, as well as about the direction that the country is moving in.
Well, it's definitely true that different groups of people experience poverty in different ways. But it's also true that there's a great overlap too. So it's important to be specific about it. If you were to ask me, and it is an important question, if you were to ask me whose experience of poverty, and this, by the way, I don't make this point in any sort of, you know, oppression Olympic sort of mindset, but it's just an observation. If you were to ask me whose experience of poverty in America was most pernicious, it would be the African American experience, because there has been stacked on top of that experience all sorts of layers of institutionalized oppression and social oppression and so forth, in which the poverty that African Americans have experienced has made them more susceptible to. So, for instance, being impoverished but also lacking access to education means that African Americans won't have the opportunities to access the sort of job opportunities that might allow them to escape the narrow confines of their poverty structure. But having said that, it is also critically important to acknowledge the fact that A, of course, poverty is a problem across ethnic lines, but that B, a lot of what we saw and what individuals like Mark Lamont Hill, very bright guy, described as a sort of a white lash in the aftermath, or, you know, in the election of Donald Trump, was also itself an expression of economic discontent that is a reflection of poverty, and that spills over into social areas. It's worth pointing out the fact that in the aftermath of the stimulus package, that is to say, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, that was President Obama's hallmark economic achievement, that package helped create about 3 million jobs or so, and I think about 8 million jobs, or maybe a little off on the figure, were ultimately generated during the Obama administration after the low point of the Great Recession. I saw a study that was repeated on CNN that said that 99% of those jobs, 99% of new jobs in the economy went to individuals with college degrees. 1% went to individuals who did not have college education. So that goes right to the class divide that Mr. Madrid is referencing. And the problem with that, beyond just the obvious fact that people need economic mobility in order to be economically mobile, pardon the tautology, is the fact that we start, if our political system is so fractured because of the social and cultural disunity that defines it, it will not be able to produce a viable economic agenda that can allow for the sort of upward mobility for blacks, whites, Asians, and Latinos that can give us the opportunity to constructively build up our own communities and not have to resort, or at least not be susceptible to, maybe that's a better way of putting it, the sort of divisive political rhetoric that is spilling out from various corners of the political spectrum. And I don't even need to name names, I think. So this intersection between class and race, it is real, does have consequences. It manifests differently in different groups, but the common denominator of this is the fact that it has a pernicious tendency to magnify itself in the context of increased stagnation in our political process that yields to increased combustibility in our social and cultural fabric. And that is a dangerous and a depressing combination. Sorry to be such a downer.
So I think it's interesting because we're kind of.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think we're kind of skirting on like an interesting topic, because one thing that Mike actually said that really stuck out to me is he said that you need the poor and the middle class, and you need all of these groups to work together cohesively. I think to look at it from a lens of, you know, whose plight has been worse is not necessarily a constructive way to look at it. If we're looking at everything from the lens of race, I don't think that it's a productive discussion at the end of the day. So it's interesting to me on that note is that, you know, in the Asian American community, we actually have some older generation folks saying, you know, those younger millennials in the Asian American community, they haven't gone through the Chinese Exclusion Act. They haven't gone through Japanese American incarceration. They need to struggle a little bit and have negative interactions with government and entities and with law enforcement to be able to really understand what true racism feels like in order to be fully immersed in politics. That's a horrible thing to say, by the way. But that, you know, this is interesting to me, because really what I think we need to think more about is how do these groups, how does the older generation, how does the younger generation, how do all communities of color work together to cohesively, you know, promote change and productivity in our society. I think we all have, we're looking at race in broken up into slices of pie. And within that, certain pieces of pie are larger or smaller, but within that, everyone wants to be, you know, in that pie and have a voice and have a seat at that table. And I think that's the important part. And how do we work together to help each other economically, politically, et cetera, et cetera.
Look, I think the question is I think the right one to be asking. I think it's the next question is and I don't want to get too far off of the racial divide question, but there is an intersection that is unmistakable between, you know, class and race in America today. It just is. And the question, again, back when I was first looking at this 20 years ago and trying to study at Latino voters, the emerging Latino demographic, the question I was trying to address was, how will Latinos emerge? Will we be more of, for lack of a better term, an aggrieved racial minority politically because of economic circumstances? Would we adopt a civil rights model that our African American brothers and sisters emulated because of the unique circumstances of African Americans in the United States? Or would it be so diffuse that that race and ethnicity by second or third generations and economic mobility would dissipate, and we would be like Italians and Greeks and Poles and Jews around the turn of the last century? And I still don't think the question has been answered in my mind, but where I do see this moving is this extraordinary racial and ethnic consciousness that started in California, frankly, in the mid-1990s with, you know, some of our politicians and some of the ballot measures that we were pursuing related to immigration, and really created for the first time a Latino bloc that transcended generational and class differences. And now, in the Trump era, we're seeing this nationally. And but I think the question still fundamentally is going to be about economic mobility. Because mobility, and look, I'm not trying to understate the importance or significance of identity and race through race and ethnicity. It's what I've spent my whole career working on. But what I will say is, there is, my guess is, and it's largely a hypothesis because we've never been through this before, is if you do have economic mobility, then you can ease some of the inevitable strains that society faces with the differences of our own race and ethnicity. And that, unfortunately, hasn't been very demonstrable, as I mentioned, with our original construct, with African Americans who have dealt with generations of racial oppression and institutional racism and the lack of economic mobility on a grand enough scale to say we're a truly equal society. Has that changed our construct with Latinos who are and will continue to be the largest, fastest growing demographic that lacks that same history as African Americans do, and why we are here and what we're economically seeking to accomplish. And then of course comes the Asian Pacific Islander construct, which is far more diverse than either of those two previous. And really for the first time in the last 10 years are you seeing significant amount of immigration from poorer Asian communities, which is challenging the construct of our stereotype of Asians who are upwardly mobile, who are going to great universities, who are immediately achieving the middle class within one generation. And we are starting to see longer periods of poverty, frankly, and less upward economic mobility. And my point is the diversity of what we have racially and ethnically is for I was gonna say for better or for worse, but I think it's for worse, requires us to look at the dynamics of both and each to understand the mobility challenges that we face so that we can have the potential of addressing the racial divides.
Thank you. So 1 year now almost into the Trump era, I'm interested in hearing, what are some of the major lessons that we've learned regarding national and statewide trends among millennials of color, and as well as among white millennials, because I think if we're having a conversation about the racial divide, we can't only talk about Black Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans. We also need to talk about white millennials. We probably should also think about Middle Eastern American millennials. But I'm interested, what are some of the trends we're seeing, especially regarding some of the issues, political issues, that they are finding extremely pertinent, And so I guess I'm opening the floor to, and as well, and I guess, and also kind of going back to the other conversation too, like, is class also playing a role in terms of where particular segments of millennials of colors are standing in terms of the political issues that matter, I guess, most to them, or where they're.
Can I jump in real quick? I promise I'll be short on this time. I won't occupy the time. The reason why I wanted to jump in is because I'm working with a candidate for statewide office who is of color and running for governor in this race, and we're expending a lot of research time and effort on millennials. And one of the really beautiful things about millennials that makes me a lot of hope is there is a concerted consciousness about the fact that they are the first generation of Americans that view race very differently. And there's a generational value which is very different than the boomers, where a lot of this stuff not only came to the forefront because of technology and people were seeing what was going on in other parts of the country very vividly, but that millennials take this on as a value and feel committed to doing something demonstrable to address kind of the previous wrongs, if you will, of previous generations. That is unique, at least in the era of modern polling, since we're going back to boomers and the greatest generation, where that is a cultural value for millennials. And no question it has to do with what I think Jody accurately characterizes some of the demographic transformations that we're seeing in this country. So I just want to put one trend, that's one thing that is unique that we are seeing.
So I think some of the lessons that we learned from the election are that millennials in general tend to skew progressive or liberal. Hillary won 55% of the youth vote. Trump carried a little more than 1/3. Is that right, Mike?
That is correct.
And the big caveat, though, I think, is that there is a group of young people that do support Trump. They tend to be white millennials without a college degree. It's really reflective of his base in general. Also, white evangelical youth, although it's interesting because white evangelical youth, although they kind of hew on the conservative side, they're less conservative than their elders. And those in rural areas, I think one of the things that millennials of color think about is this intersection of race and class, definitely among the Latino population. Latino millennials are almost half of all Latino eligible voters, and they're really the proportion of the population that's driving Latino voter growth, or the vote among Latino eligible voters. And even though, and let me also say that contrary to what Trump says about Latinos or Mexicans in general, the majority of Latinos in the US are not undocumented. In fact, the majority of Latinos in the US are native born, about 3/4. And this is also true in the state of California. And while they may be, Latinos in general may be native born and on the younger side, they're the youngest racial ethnic group in the country, they are also connected to immigrant parents and immigrant communities. And so immigration remains an issue to them, and the persistent villainization of their ethnic group is certainly important as well. And we learned this in the election. And also, I think one of the things, thinking about some of the research that I've been doing on the Latino middle class and the Latino elite, we actually saw some Latino elites, not all, because not all Latinos voted for Hillary, certainly. Some of the exit polls have it at, 30% of Latinos voted for Trump, roughly. But there were actually many Latino elites, or the upper class of Latinos, who actually switched parties, who were Republican and ended up voting Democrat precisely because of the villainization of their group. And so that's actually something that is contrary to kind of this race and class intersection oftentimes, but was important, again, because of the ways in which Trump attacked the Latino population.
Well, I don't think that we've necessarily learned very much that we didn't already know about millennials during the Trump era thus far. I think that where we learned some interesting things and maybe some new things, or at least where we observed some trends really become magnified that hadn't been quite as magnified previously, was during the primaries, in particular the Democratic primaries, and more particularly still millennial support for Bernie Sanders. At the high point of the Democratic primary, poll was conducted, I forget who by, saying that when millennials were asked, who do you respect more than any public figure in America, Bernie Sanders was not only at the top of that list, but at the top of that list by a wide margin over every other political figure. And over figures like Oprah Winfrey and, all sorts of folks you would have considered to be conventionally just sort of like mainstream appealing. More admired, in fact, than Barack Obama. Now, there's a bit of an interesting irony in that, because of the fact that I think that, and to much of Jody's point, part of a really major thing that animates the activities of millennials for the most part in America, most millennials, is this commitment to this sort of universal value of emphasizing the necessity for equity amongst different groups, amongst marginalized groups, amongst oppressed groups, amongst different racial groups, so on and so forth. And the reason I say that's ironic is just because I think that a lot of people gravitated to Bernie Sanders' campaign who felt that way. And it's ironic just because Bernie Sanders was not himself a person who was necessarily pushing that message very hard, but he was advocating for this very sort of holistic transformation of the American economy that I think would have seemed to have lent itself to the necessity of kind of redesigning our structures so as to create more equality that would rebound to the benefit of different marginalized groups. But in the support for Bernie Sanders that was called forth among diverse millennials, you saw a rejection of much of the Clinton legacy for precisely the reasons that the Clinton legacy seemed to push against the grain of equality for different races in different areas. I mean, you know, just in particular things like the perception of the Clinton crime bill, Hillary's use of the phrase super predators way back in the 90s and so forth. And whether you think these things are fair or unfair, it's no doubt true that millennials and democratic millennials looked at what had long been this sort of headlining a political franchise in the Democratic Party, namely the Clinton family, as suddenly being on the side, or at least having a legacy that was on the side of institutional oppression. So in this sense, today's millennials are kind of reflective of the way young people were in the 60s in a sense. Now circumstances are different, but the animating factor you see, certainly for millennials on the left, which is where most millennials are, is a desire to see the advancement of the diverse sort of color spectrum of American society. And even for millennials who vote Republican, a great number of them are libertarians who subscribe to a more sort of socially liberal point of view, and they too have a commitment to maintaining and augmenting the kind of diverse fabric and color of American ethnic life. So I think that this quality makes millennials somewhat distinctive, but I think that the underside of that is that it also comes along in many instances with a distrust of American institutions that goes so far as to kind of reject the legitimacy of a lot of American institutions, to the point to where you see some young people who are pressing against free speech on college campuses, who are sort of rejecting of not just a more or less free market system, but the idea of capitalism by and large. And there can definitely be dangers in excess that come from this sort of more generically positive inclination to advocate for the rights of Americans of all colors. So it's complicated. But I think a defining characteristic of today's millennials is the fact that not only is diversity important, but it's central in advocating for the empowerment of the diverse array of American ethnic groups and so on and so forth, is central to the identity, politically speaking, of millennials.
See, that's interesting, because I found, especially in terms of my work running an institute, that at least the millennials who describe, especially those on the left, they're extremely skeptical of diversity as a framework, right? Inevitably, they're looking at, many of them look at diversity as a framework, as a concept that's been appropriated by business institutions, universities, as a way of kind of like checking off boxes, filling quotas, presenting a kind of public image of, look, we participate in, you know, in engaging and connecting, you know, the kind of multi-layered, kind of multifaceted fabric of our society, while still kind of continuing in a pursuit of profit, and still positioning those who have been at the center. So it's particularly interesting to hear that, because I'm also interested too in, you know, especially when we think about the ways that folks have been mobilizing at Berkeley, you know, and other places. You know, what role, for instance, also is social media, digital technologies playing in circulating, you know, quote unquote, like real information and facts, as well as, you know, things that we know are not facts, but nonetheless become truths that then various groups try to position as a truth in galvanizing a variety of different publics. So I'm interested, kind of shifting the conversation also to talking about technology, and the role that technology is playing, both in framing identity and in framing the issues, but as well as you know, the debates that have emerged too about like what is truth, what is fact, and how we've seen that turn into its own kind of monster of sorts.
Can I pick up on just
sure, I mean,
that you
honestly, this is supposed to be more conversation, so if there's something that stands out from one of our comments, it's important that we can also feel that we can kind of respond or engage.
Oh yeah, for sure. No, I just wanted to say, because you mentioned the fact that the young people that you work with don't necessarily look at diversity as an intrinsic good, and I
well, they do. They look at diversity. They look at difference. Mm-hmm. If anything, what I'm seeing more and more is an emphasis upon difference and recognizing that difference is really what unifies us all. and really centering our differences as a way of building connections and also generating empathy, generating opportunities that actually then build solidarity that then turn into political action.
Right.
That diversity for some has become more of a kind of corporate mandate.
Well, right, because you said...
Yeah, diversity capitalism, that
right,
it's a central facet of neoliberalism as opposed to something that's emerging from the grassroots.
Well, right, because you mentioned the appropriation of diversity, and I completely get that perspective, and I think that you saw a real sort of kind of, I hate to laugh, but it was a little amusing to me, a real backlash against the sort of appropriation of the diversity ethos as, presenting it as something substantive in the context of that Pepsi commercial with the Kardashian sister, which in the middle of, what looked like possibly, a BLM protest or something like that, she gives a Pepsi can to a Coke, and it's like, there you go, corporate America will solve all of our problems as long as you got people of all colors in the commercial. And folks rejected that, and kind of understandably so. But just like you also mentioned, I mean, difference is something that I think is highlighted in the Millennial Coalition because I think it's core to that kind of political identity in many respects. But, obviously the fault lines are such as they are in terms of rejecting the kind of, appropriation of that. So, yeah, no, I don't reject that analysis at all on that way. Yeah.
But I guess also to the point, I mean, whether it's about difference and diversity or also more so kind of about technology and the role that technology is playing, both as a tool, but also potentially as a roadblock. Do you find that to be the case in terms of millennials and their viewpoints, perspectives about electoral politics, about issues of racial injustice or inequity?
I think that millennials have shown a great attention to fight for people who have marginalized and intersecting identities in a variety of movements, whether it's Black Lives Matter, which really started, I mean, today's movements that millennials are spearheading are very different than what we saw during the Civil Rights Movement, for example. They're decentralized movements. Many start on social media, like Black Lives Matter with the hashtag Black Lives Matter that was elevated. And if you look at immigrant rights groups that are led by today's youth, social media is of the utmost importance to these kinds of movements. I think there's also this question of whether people are simply these armchair activists via social media and aren't actually participating in meaningful ways. But social media has certainly become critical to disseminating information, and it's something that makes today's movements among millennials very different than what we've seen in the past.
So, yeah, a couple points. The first is one thing I did. There was a really insightful moment in the 2016 Democratic primary that really did, I think, capture the intersection between race and millennial viewpoints, and that was the week when Hillary Clinton squeaked out a victory in the Nevada caucuses over Bernie Sanders. And the data was showing, and it remained consistent in all states except for, interestingly, Texas, that said if you were a Hispanic over the age of 40, 70% of Hispanics over 40 voted for Hillary. For Hispanics under 40, 70% were breaking for Bernie Sanders. That was the first time in my history of looking at these races far too closely than any human being should, saw that kind of generational break with an ethnic group. It was all the more fascinating because Hillary then had her firewall state of South Carolina a week later, where African Americans overwhelmingly of all age generations and cohorts came back to the establishment candidate, largely because of that racial construct. And there was a lot of discussion about African American race and construct at that time, and African Americans overwhelmingly supported Hillary Clinton in that primary over Bernie Sanders. So you can see this millennial break happening to a much greater degree. I'm not going to suggest it's not happening with African Americans, but for African Americans, at least in that, through a lot of these primary races, race and identity was the construct that was far more important than a generational split that you saw with whites and Latinos. So just as a point. The second issue is on social media. I'm as a political practitioner, somebody who's involved in campaigns, I'm horrified by what is happening. I know all of us as Americans are, and the reason why is because as media gets more and more segmented, the emanation of Fox News and MSNBC, both of which are junk food for your brain, by the way. If you somehow think Rachel Maddow is more virtuous than Sean Hannity, you're part of the problem, because they're both, it's like just eating a Big Mac every day and just thinking you're somehow going to get better. It's really, really bad. And what happens then is social media, we have found this consistently over the past 4 or 5 years now, voters don't want news. They don't want to be informed. They want to hear what they are predisposed to already believe. And this is something that is not Republican or Democrat or white or black or Asian or Latino. It is pervasive amongst all groups. And as we become more partisan, it is becoming more intense. And it is why you have these voters that are unshakable on both sides and will accommodate these horrible things from their own candidates and refuse to see the flaws that they clearly are demonstrating very, very publicly, and not just doing them out of mistaken slips, but are doing them consciously now. This is a trend that is going to not only continue, but it is going to speed up. I'm not suggesting it's a forever thing, but it's forever in the short term. Not just because it makes political, and I'm saying this very consciously and cautiously, not just because it makes political sense, meaning electoral sense for politicians to get elected, but because we want it, and we fuel it, and we thrive on it. And it's happening at a rate that is absolutely frightening for me as a practitioner. I've never seen this kind of political communication in my 25-year career.
So I think on that note, it just goes to show that there's such a saturation in the content that's out there in social media. And I'm thinking back to the conversation that we were having earlier, right before this panel started, where, and this was true for me too, even though I am a millennial, where my mom told me, you have to find the answers in the encyclopedia. If you want to write your book report, go look in the encyclopedia for, I don't know, great white tigers or something like that. Whereas now on social media, you can utilize that for anything and everything. You can learn how to cook a meal. You can watch a clip of the latest comedy show. You can catch up on entire seasons of episodes through social media. And it's really starting to influence the way that we think as voters as well, because it's so easy to plug in and get the exact information, the exact facts, whether or not they be true or not, in the fashion that we want to hear them in. And I think social media is scary, but it's a resource. It could be a resource, but it's also scary in terms of fake news or false information being further disseminated to a greater audience. But I also think it's interesting that it's also forcing social media companies to rethink their strategies as well. And they're having to quickly adapt to all of these things too. You hear Mark Zuckerberg coming out the other day of like being very, very concerned about Russia having a involvement in the 2016 elections, with Facebook also now integrating the town hall function, where you're able to have more live stream video content of things going on in the community of town halls, interacting with the candidates, and that being a new function that was never on Facebook before, but getting a large push from both political campaigns as well as community organizations like Cause to be able to utilize that function in greater capacity.
I know, at least in 2008, with the election of President Barack Obama, we saw one of the largest turnouts of voters, especially voters who hadn't voted prior, especially working poor voters who came up to turn out. But since then, we've seen it decrease, both at a national level and a statewide level. And I'm interested to get you all's perspective. Number one, do millennials of color view electoral politics as a viable institutional site to make their voices heard, to enact change, or is that less and less? And as well, what did we learn even from the last, local elections regarding the turnout among millennials of color? And what does that mean as well for, the midterm elections in 2018?
Let me speak about this is because I'm very passionate about this and obviously very concerned about it. Let me talk about Los Angeles County specifically. When Tom Bradley ran against Sam Yorty for mayor of Los Angeles, we had a 78% turnout. When Eric Garcetti just ran for re-election earlier this year, we had a 21% turnout. Now, two things have dramatically changed in LA County, and they are correlate, as I kind of made the case before. The first is we're exponentially more diverse, especially a lot more Latino, but the middle class has completely collapsed in Los Angeles County, and what we are seeing is a county that is divided largely by a shrinking share of wealthy white people on the coast and a dramatic surge in poor, younger brown people. And it does not matter to me or any researcher who's looking at data, but if you are a poor African American in the South, or a poor Latino in Los Angeles, or a poor white person in Appalachia, your tendency to vote is virtually non-existent. So it's not a millennial problem, it's not a black, brown, or any other color problem, it's a class problem. And what we see is where the economy, the middle class erodes, voter participation erodes commensurate with it. When people don't have a stake in their society, there is literally no reason for people to vote. So we hear that as buzzwords all the time. People are apathetic because they don't think it matters. Folks, it doesn't matter if you're poor. Nothing is happening in society where you see government as a solution, because a rational person could make that conclusion. So as long as we're seeing this stratification continue, we're going to see the weakening of civic engagement, especially amongst the growing classes of the poor, the working poor, the shrinking middle class, and overwhelmingly, those are people of color.
Yeah, I think that I think that Mike is correct about that, and I've got some figures from Pew sitting in front of me. This is from January 2015, but they polled Americans who were in their categories, quote, most financially secure and those who were least financially secure. 94% of Americans who were most financially secure were registered to vote at that time, early 2015. Only 54% of those who were least financially secure were registered. 42% of those Americans who were most financially secure contacted an elected official to lobby them about something or to ask for some service or the other. Only 14% of those who were least financially secure. But as Mike also alluded to, these class breakdowns correlate strongly along racial lines. So, I mean, you go back to 2008, and, you know, individuals came out to vote for Barack Obama who had not voted, who just simply hadn't voted before, including individuals who were old enough to have voted in prior elections. And so the turnout was increased among minorities in general, among African Americans in particular, including amongst minorities who were lower on the income scale, because they thought that there was, perhaps some of it was cultural unity, but I think the other part of it was just a belief that this time there might be the opportunity to actually change things. And you see some of that turnout going down a bit in 2012. With Donald Trump, I think you see a parallel sort of thing on the other side of that political equation. You had individuals who, different demographic obviously, but who were poor, whose economic opportunities had been constricted, who didn't do well under the Obama years, financially speaking, coming out maybe in many cases to make cultural statements, but I think probably just as often at least, to support somebody who they thought was actually going to bring their jobs back from China, who was actually going to prevent the deportation, the insourcing of jobs from Latin America, I guess, through deportation or something like that. So, you know, these dynamics are always intertwined, and that's why you have to have a viable platform economically to impact the social side of things, but you also have to have a healthy sort of social conversation and cross-cultural conversation to create the space to develop a political platform to be able to enable the progress of the economy. And that's a difficult knot to untie, but getting beyond the kind of partisan cable news, talk radio conversation that's been alluded to here, I think is an important step to actually making that happen.
Yeah, I would just add a couple points and maybe lift up some of the things you said. I mean, when you think about it, Hillary, what was her economic message? She didn't have one. Trump had an economic message. Bernie had an economic message. Trump's economic message, I'm going to bring back those manufacturing jobs, right? Which we know aren't coming back, but he had one. I know I look good, but I'm not a millennial. So I asked my class this morning, who are all millennials, this very question. And they're all millennials of color in my class earlier today. And they said that electoral politics don't work for them. They did not come out to vote because they are concerned about their economic mobility in this country. They're concerned about their parents. Many of them work 2 to 3 jobs just to make ends meet. They are also helping to support their families, many of whom fared and still are faring poorly in the aftermath of the recession. And they do not see politics, as Mike said, as something that is actually going to change their lives. They do not think that the people they will potentially vote for actually care about them. Now, a few of my students said that they'd rather vote on like local propositions because those are the things that matter to them and that they know that they can actually have a say in, and those are the things that are going to directly affect their lives. And so I think today's youth feel a sense of alienation from politics, and candidates do not speak to them in a way that Bernie Sanders did, because he did have a message. Healthcare is a right for all, education is a right for all, and those are things that resonated with today's youth.
So my experience is also a lot with working with younger generation voters as well, and just trying to convince them that it's so important for you to go and vote. But I think one important thing that we all kind of underestimate is that you really have to contextualize politics for them. Because when you hear politics in the political lens, are we saying infrastructure or are we saying freeways? It's a very different way of looking at politics. And so when you grow up in a community where politics has failed you and the political system has failed you and you're still living in poverty, you can't access higher education, you're not likely to see your vote as, important to the political process. A very real example of this is I have a colleague, and he asked students in Boyle Heights, what do you care about with regards to the environment? And they could have said any number of things that are very local, right? They could have said, I want to see more, public parks and greenery and trees in my community. But for them, they're growing up in an area where all they see is an urban jungle. To them, the environmental issues are mountains. They're not going to see mountains in Boyle Heights, but maybe they need access to, clean drinking water. Those are all things that, we think of when it comes to natural resources and the environment, but they aren't able to see politics in that lens, because you really have to bring it to them and bring it to politics in a way that they can see and engage in, so that they feel as though it's important for them to be a part of the process. It's a lot about, rather than just telling them, actually showing them. Another example too is just convincing students that, hey, did you know you could call the city about the pothole in front of your house? And for them it's like, yeah, but they're not going to answer, they're not going to do anything about it. And then actually picking up the phone and calling the city and saying, hey, just want you to know that there's this pothole in like Temple, and what intersects with Temple? I don't know. My geography is obviously bad, but them actually getting a response and hearing that on the speakerphone was just jaw-dropping for them. So being able to actually show the students, hey, that your political activism and being engaged in civics and the political process is important, is vital.
So I do want to make sure we have time for conversation and exchange with the attendees and everyone who's here. So we're opening up right now for Q&A. Anyone want to start us off with the first question? I see a hand up right here. Should I give your microphone?
Thank you all for being here. This has been a really interesting conversation. So to dramatically oversimplify, I think there might be 2 general dispositions about how to deal with the problems and controversies over diversity. And those seem to be a kind of almost naive colorblindness that values individuals in unity but ignores real social problems. And then on the other end, kind of almost counterproductive identity politics that doesn't address the problem of unity and sometimes exacerbates it. So if these are the two, and feel free to disagree on that analysis, but if these are the two general dominant ways of looking at diversity issues in modern America, and they aren't going anywhere anytime soon, is there room for compromise somewhere in the middle of those two? Is there room to kind of synthesize ways to manage diversity and manage the different political problems coming out of it that are better for everybody?
Yeah, I think that sort of works as a simplified framing of the extremes here. I think that the challenge that we really have right now is being able to reconcile the fact that the United States of America, the melting pot, right? That you have all these different groups of people who have their own histories and their own unique sets of circumstances and so forth. And that yet, for a nation to kind of be cohesive and optimally functional and so forth, you would tend to think that there would need to be a level of cultural unity, or at least some basic agreement on certain values that provides a common platform. Well, I guess a common sort of synthesis of things that are universally important across a diverse spectrum. And I think the reason Americans fell in love with Barack Obama's campaign in 2008 was because he seemed to strike a tone that wanted to veer in that kind of direction. I think that's what Americans want. But I think that the fault line, the tightrope that we have to walk, that I would like to see us begin to walk a bit, because I want my kids to grow up in an America where, on the one hand, the unique circumstances of their and my children, individuals and so forth, individual identity is very important. But I want my kids to grow up in a society where the particular challenges and obstacles facing their group are acknowledged by society and dealt with in an appropriate and proportional way, while still not having that tear at some sense of fundamental values that Americans as a whole might be able to rally around to preserve the idea that the United States of America is e pluribus unum, out of many one, right? And it's a cyclical dilemma, because we've gone through conflicts over this kind of dynamic generation after generation, and I think on the whole there's been a lot of progress made, but I do think that that's the way to kind of visualize the objective here. How is it that we're able to do justice to the particular and legitimate grievances and struggles of different groups of Americans of all colors, while also sort of within the midst of that, maintaining a vision of America that is based on the idea that all people are created equal, deserving of equal opportunity, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and translating those ideals into a spectrum of policy formulations that can actually honor them beyond just the rhetoric of inclusiveness. And it's a difficult thing to do, but I do think that it can be done, and I think that that's where the energies of the political spectrum ideally should be channeled towards. So, that's the direction I think we ought to try and go.
I think the answer is simply yes, and I think there's a lot of overthinking of this stuff, candidly. Look, where the economy is doing well, people get along, by and large. I'm not going to say there aren't differences. There will always be differences. As long as somebody has a bigger house than somebody else, or a different car than somebody else, as long as there are differences, there will be differences. But where there is opportunity, where there is hope and opportunity, right? People want that. They look for that. But I think it's important to understand that we have not had that, and I would disagree, we have not had that in a president for a long time. And that is a function of the big sort phase where we're at in American politics, where people are self-identifying, not necessarily through racial or ethnic lenses, although that's a big part of it, but politically through their lenses. A wide swath of America fell in love with Barack Obama, but not all of America fell in love with Barack Obama. And we need to acknowledge that. Because if you don't, this is what you end up with, okay? Economic dislocation breeds fear and anger. That needs to be the central starting point of where we go. And I think it's incredibly dismissive to say, those manufacturing jobs are gone, they're just gone. That's a horrible way to look at and run a country or society of your fellow countrymen. And until we get beyond that and start finding a role and a place where everyone of every race, creed, color, geography has a stake in our society, we won't have that. Until we have that, we won't have that. That should be the goal. And when that is the central focus, yeah, we can get past that.
Can I add one thing? I think I would also add, part of one of the things I think we have to also, to me there's a number of things we have to reconcile. And it kind of builds off Mr. Wood's point. We have to reconcile this history both of, immigration and really, first off, the diverse kinds of experience of immigration, of immigrant experience, but as well as like the history of colonization in this country and the continuous kind of nature of the colonial experiment which America has been and how that impacts generations of past and today. And I think it also ties into us having to also reconcile what kinds of sacrifices are we willing to make as a society. So it's not simply about how do we incorporate people into the workforce, but as well as like what kinds of things do we have to be willing to sacrifice, right? What kind of educational system do we have, right? How do we have an educational system that really is a failure, that allows folks who live in a particular zip code access to things that folks who live in a various other zip code right alongside it, they don't have access to, right? To me, there's a variety of things that we have to really, like, not only just take into mind, but really have to produce action and policy about giving up some of the benefits of wealth and the income gap and resource allocation in order to really produce an equitable society, an equitable community. Other questions? Yes.
I'm also thinking about like historicizing this as millennials who are living in a digital era, kind of bringing together some ideas that I'm hearing about like identity politics. I feel like these algorithms put us into silos. Like I know if I look at my internet timeline, I'm seeing black girl magic. I probably see more black people die than my white friends do. Is this something that, like getting over that, and I know we're talking about like self-selecting into Fox News versus MSNBC, is this something that's an individual responsibility? Do you put responsibility on our media outlets, our social networking outlets? You put responsibility on the state? Like where do you put that responsibility on moving beyond the silos in order to overcome this racial divide?
Well, I think it's a fantastic question. First of all, because I think that's critical. We are siloed. We are balkanized. I don't think that anybody has a difference of opinion on that here fundamentally. But the difficulty is in trying to sort of break out of or see beyond a kind of pattern of digital behavior that has been facilitated and given shape to by the fact that our appetite for this technology is pretty much insatiable, and that it's part of its appeal is the fact that social media and streaming and these different platforms kind of allow us to customize our reality, or at least they present content to us in a way that pretends at least to want to appeal directly to our preferences on the basis of whatever it perceives our preferences to be, or whatever it can deduce our identity might be, depending on what information we've given it, so on and so forth. So my wife will get sort of irritated sometimes because she'll watch a show like Blackish or something like that on Hulu, then it'll come up with a suggestion saying something like, oh, you like Blackish? We'll also like Roots. And it's like, it's not exactly the same thing, But so, the technology has a way of simplifying us, but we have a way of simplifying each other though, too. And that's part of the danger in this. I noticed that when my friends are communicating, I've got a really chaotic Facebook feed because I've got probably equal numbers of associates from way to the right and way to the left and so forth. And it's always sometimes they'll come together and they'll actually have insightful conversations. So social media does facilitate that sometimes. But for the most part, we're just shouting at each other from across different trenches of stereotypes and so forth, you know, throwing facts and figures from different media sites that the other side doesn't even recognize the legitimacy of. I think that so to answer your question, I think that the onus of responsibility, it does have to start off falling on us as individuals, because so long as that kind of behavior is profitable for social media and technological platforms to sort of exploit in their models, they're not going to change the way they organize things. I mean, we can petition Facebook to change its algorithms in whatever sort of way, but if as individuals we start to look beyond our siloed canisters of information for information that allows us to more substantively understand people who fall beyond whatever that paradigm is, we'll be more effective communicators. We can network on a group level people who want to come together and use social media sites to be able to start up clubs of people that are dedicated to pursuing a more diversified sort of conversation, or who are dedicated to advocating for issues, not just on the basis of some mutual identity, but on the basis of some shared desire for progress for people of all groups or whatever groups. We can do things creatively to see to it that our conversations and communications aren't simply directed by the default tendency of technology to polarize us, but to use that technology creatively to empower ourselves as communicators and people who are positioned or trying to position ourselves to understand the stories of Americans from across the spectrum. So there's a lot more to it than that. But if the individual takes that attitude, then I feel like that's a good place to begin. So I hope that more or less gets to your question.
Yeah, I have a thought about this, and I think a lot of us have been thinking quite a bit about your question. It's a truly good one. And to me, it goes back to a TED Talk I watched where a biologist was trying to ascertain what the human species' main evolutionary characteristic was, what made us successful as a species. And in his research, his opinion was that we had empathy towards one another. At a certain point in our evolutionary cycle, we wanted each other and we needed each other to survive. And I don't know if where we're at technologically, if that's true anymore. But what I do know is that there is no overarching authority that can impose empathy. It's incumbent upon each one of us to be empathetic to one another and to demonstrate our need to each other. And the great irony is, at a time when our technology allows us, if everybody just took one empathetic action, again, I don't want to sound too Pollyannish here, right? But think about it. The irony is that we are so interconnected that if we demonstrated our most human trait, our most successful evolutionary human trait, what a different place this would be. So to me, it's our own individual responsibility.
You can't legislate love, right?
Nor should you. I don't think that's the role of it, and that's a different panel for tomorrow. Come back at noon. But I don't think that those things. To be uniquely human, we have an opportunity to express our unique humanity as a species in a way that no generation has ever had before. And if we just tapped into that a little bit, I think we'd be living in a remarkably different place.
In the back.
Strategist Albertas. Strategy of creating an enemy always win until today, especially in the politics. If you create enemy and gathering the people against the enemy, you always win. But this is against the gender or race issue. It's people seeking good life, equal life. Maybe someday from the space, something coming out to the world, and maybe all the world people, all the people in the world, maybe against this enemy we will gather. But I don't think so. We have like this enemy right now. For or against this strategy at politics, sometimes in the security area. I am a security strategist. What we can do more? That's the question.
I think we need to force, and this ties closely to the last question, I would say, I think we need to force ourselves to be, you can get your information in two ways, is how I say. You can get it through news and just doing a bunch of research, or you can immerse yourself in civic engagement. And I think that you need to do both at the end of the day. So what can we do? I think surround yourself in an environment or an atmosphere where you're not always in a space where other people's perspectives or experiences have been your own, because when you do expose yourself to differing perspectives and experiences, you get things happening like with what Jody was talking about earlier, where communities are empathizing with each other and coming together and doing things. An example of this, I would say, is when Trump came out with the Muslim ban, the travel ban, and there were protests all over LAX and all of the airports across the world. The Japanese American community came together and did several public discussions and public forums about the ban, and seeing parallels to all the way back to World War II with Japanese American incarceration, and how this is a repeat of history and how we need to not go back to those times and revert to those experiences. But that wouldn't have happened if we're not coming from a place of empathy and understanding of each other's perspectives.
And actually, I would add, it's not simply up to the individual, it's up to the collectives and institutions to facilitate that for individuals. We can't expect individuals to automatically know how to, not simply just have an empathetic feeling, but to enact that in action if they're not placed in a space where they can then exercise that capacity. A number of activists I know, they basically say no one should be allowed to vote if they have never visited a prison, if they've never spent a night in a hospital in a low-income neighborhood, if they've never visited and spent some time in a school in a low-income neighborhood, that many folks are making decisions on the behalf of people who they have no understanding of their daily reality. And inevitably, you can't expect an individual to be able to exercise that capacity if there aren't institutions that are facilitating that use of that capacity to be human. So I agree, we can't legislate love, but we can legislate a different standard of living. That is something that can be enacted in policy. And I think educational institutions like this one, you have a variety of programs that are doing this kind of work. You have professors who are doing this kind of work, people who run institutions like Cause that are doing this kind of work. But I do think empathy is necessary, but we also have to come to some agreement about what a human being should be afforded just because they are a human being.
I would just add to that excellent point that you made, Taj, which is that, you know, in America, mobility and opportunities are often seen as a zero-sum game, and it is not. We need to get off our Facebook pages and work with institutions and organizations to create multiracial and multi-generational coalitions, and understanding to really acknowledge the fact that our future is a collective one. I'm just curious, how many of you regularly talk to someone who has a different political viewpoint than your own?
Talk?
Yes. Like, really talk. Wow, that's more than I actually imagined. But, you know, getting off of your Facebook feed, and I'm guilty of the siloed information myself, and talking to each other in environments like this, as Taj said, and really knowing and understanding the difficulties that people are facing all over this country in different ways.
I think that is all of our time. Why don't we thank our panelists for joining us today.